Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got James Cairns with us tonight. We're going to talk about crisis, and crises. He's got a book called In Crisis, On Crisis, Essays in Troubled Times. And I found it really quite interesting because, it seems like we're in nonstop crises. What is the plural for crisis? I think it's crises, I believe. Because
I think so.
We got the pandemic, then we got the climate crisis, then we got a housing crisis, then we got a trade war, and the federal election that we just went through, the provincial election we just went through, the U.S. election. They all seem to be called the most important elections of our time. So it seems like we're going through nonstop crises. And by the way, we've got a war in Eastern Europe. We got a war in the Middle East. It looks like we got a war in India and Pakistan. Who knows? China's going to attack Taiwan. Do we have a world war? Oh, and then we're flying planes to South Africa to bring back refugees from white South Africa. Like, what is going on in this world? So, James, why did you write this book about crises? It seems like we got more than enough crisis to go around.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you put it really well. And what's sort of funny to me is that when I look up today and think how timely and appropriate it feels with the book coming out at the beginning of next month, I have to remind myself that I started this book 6 or 7 years ago during the first Trump presidency. And so let me just tell you a little bit about where the book came from, and that might help set the frame for figuring out the crises of where we are now. So as I say, during the first Trump presidency, about halfway through, I began to notice a real explosion in books and articles talking about the crisis of democracy. I don't know if you'll remember, there was a couple of really popular books. Well, right, exactly. We've become so used to it. Books of that time, with titles like How Democracy Ends, The End of Democracy, Crises of Democracy. And as a political scientist, I mean, that's really interesting to me, and certainly something I've thought a lot about. Written a book about democracy before. If democracy is in crisis, what exactly does that mean? I certainly understood at that time sort of the impetus for these extreme concerns. Trump had blundered and blustered his way through 2 years in office. This was on the sort of cliff of Brexit being imposed. Trump was being investigated and soon would be impeached. And people were feeling angry, frustrated, worried about the ways in which certain norms were being eroded in the politics, especially in the United States. But did this add up to a crisis? What exactly were people saying? Was a question that was just interesting to me in my own research. And so I began to follow media coverage of that discussion, as well as read those books widely. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that this word crisis tends to be one that we take for granted about what exactly we mean by that. And yet, it gets used in all sorts of different ways in that crisis of democracy debate. Some people are saying, well, crisis is a bad time, a scary time. Other people are really suggesting that democracy is on the edge of collapse, like it's going to fall apart, or others even saying we're sort of past that point, and the first Trump presidency is fascist. And so at that point, my interest kind of deepened or took another direction, and it was not only specifically about the crisis of democracy under Trump, but the usage of the term crisis, both by journalists as well as scholars and sort of people in their everyday lives. And I began to read and familiarize myself with this wide body of writing on theories of crisis. What do we mean by that? And where does the word come from? And so on. It has a fascinating history. It's rooted back in ancient Greek, referring to the decisive turning point in a grave illness where the patient either dies or begins to recover. The crisis point is that moment of really do or die. The ancient Greek verb krino or krinon, meaning to decide, to judge, to select. Then it gets used differently throughout history in ways that we can talk about if you like. But that I just find fascinating, and I'm reading about it all the time. And then kind of a third idea or realization hits me as to why this is so, why I'm becoming sort of obsessed or focusing on this in the way that I am. And that's because there's something about this idea of crisis as a moment of extreme danger and instability, a decisive turning point, that's very, very familiar in my own personal life as an alcoholic. I mean, everything I know about sort of thinking about the word crisis and what it means to be in a do or die situation, as much as I'm thinking about that politically and with respect to my scholarly research, there's something about the memory and experience over 20, 30 years of my life of periods of out of control drinking, the resolves to quit, a sudden reversal in fortunes, a relapse, a recommitment, a falling apart, an explosion. And as a scholar and as someone who thought he was sort of following up on something that was exclusive to the political world and very much in the headlines at the moment, I kind of had to reckon with the fact that this meant something to me, not just in that aspect of my life, but in my personal life as well. And I guess I had a choice now how to pursue the book, how to write the book, strictly as a political science text, a scholarly text exploring the history and the current usages of this term. And I've written a couple of books like that before, looking at the concept of entitlement, looking at the concept of democracy, without really saying much about my personal life. Or I could write something more of a hybrid where I'm pursuing both interests simultaneously. And I chose the latter. I mean, my experience as an alcoholic, my struggle against out of control drinking is not something I have written about. It's not something I've talked about publicly prior to now. I think I'm able to do so in a way that many people aren't because of the security of my job and the social standing that profs hold. And so I also have a very strong, supportive family and friend network. I'm not saying it was easy. I come at this topic with all kinds of privilege, but it was important to me to figure out these interconnecting lines of sort of meaning and relevance about crises, big crises, small crises that we experience sort of as our, one among many in a social group, as well as the kind of day-to-day pinpricks of everyday time in our own lives, whether that's alcoholism or a health crisis or a mental health crisis or any of the other situations that I'm sure most of your listeners have found themselves in at one time or another.
So, James, I think that it's I firmly believe this, and I've said it on numerous times that people want to understand people. They don't want to just get a lecture, and so therefore, having you open up and be so vulnerable and authentic, I think is very helpful and critically important. But what's your objective then? Is it to just tell people that there's crises and there's crises in life and there's crises in personal life and there's crises in democracy, or are you trying to tell people that it's normal, or are you trying to tell people how to get through it, or what's the objective, sir?
Great question. And one thing I'll say from the top is that my choice to write the book as a collection of essays rather than as a sort of a single focused academic monograph or single issue book was partially to give myself the chance, the space to explore the very questions that you're asking without feeling the need to have all of them answered in a neatly tied up, packaged whole. The essay form as a form of writing is one that allows for kind of sharing a process of thinking, of moving through uncertainties, tensions, and trying to drive toward a deeper meaning without needing to advance a singular, battle-tested thesis in the same way that much of the other writing I have done before. So I'll say the sorts of ideas that I hope that people are taking from the book. But you'll have to tell me whether it amounts to something substantive enough for your taste. I think one of the things that I wanted people to think about along with me is the way that our experiences of crises are nested always in a relationship between our individual selves and the social world in which we live. And I think that we tend to bracket those two spheres of experience from one another. And so we're either talking about the ecological crisis, which is global in nature and rooted in science and economic patterns that go beyond our individual scope, or we're talking about crisis of addiction or an individual's midlife crisis or something like that. And what I tried to do in many of the essays is to move between these two levels of experience, both to share my own story of what that feels and looks like, and to encourage other people to think about how their own individual lives are shaped by and could potentially influence the social world. But also, when we're talking about economic crises or the ecological crisis or democracy in crisis, what does that feel like, and what possibilities are open or foreclosed at the individual daily level of the citizen or something like that? So that's one sort of overall hope or invitation that the book is providing. The other is to encourage people to think about what has been called the politics of crisis talk. So there's a book by a sociologist named Andrew Simon Gilbert called The Crisis Paradigm. And what he argues is that instead of thinking about there being events out in the world that we can call crisis, that sort of we can measure with objective tools, the way we can measure the weather or some other external event or phenomenon. He says, actually, what crises really are much more about our ability to convince each other, ourselves, one another, that a certain event or experience adds up to a crisis. Let me try to explain this one more. I don't think I did a great job on that. What he's trying to say is there's always an important component of storytelling, framing the world, selecting certain elements of experience and leaving out others, that leads people to define one situation as a crisis and others as not. And every time that we define something as a crisis, we identify it as an urgent problem that requires intervention, a solution, where certain solutions are available and legitimate and others are not. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean here. So we hear people talk about the tariff crisis that we're currently living under. Well, is the nature of the crisis a crisis of Canadian sovereignty, as I think it often gets represented as? So, this is, we're all in this together. We all need to unite in order to fight back the threat to sovereignty that the crisis imposes? Or is it a crisis for working people across borders, Canadian workers, workers in the US and Mexico, who are going to suffer from the efforts of business elites and to download the economic costs of the tariffs onto workers and consumers? I mean, just exactly what the crisis is and how it gets labeled will effectively encourage people to consider some resolutions, some responses as necessary, and others as off the table. The other one that comes to my mind is something like the housing crisis. The way that the Ford government frames a housing crisis is as a lack of available homes. And to the extent to which the crisis is understood that way, then the answer is we need to build more homes. And so then that opens up all kinds of different policy responses and necessities, whether that's developing on previously untouched farmland, or building bigger highways in order to feed those new communities or whatever. But there's another way to frame the housing crisis, and that's as a lack of affordable housing. And to say, the problem is not that there is a lack of empty homes. You can look around, there's all kinds of empty homes, all kinds of empty apartment units. But because housing is not a publicly accessible universal right, but something that we access through the market, certain populations are excluded if they don't have the money to buy. And so I think that what Gilbert is saying when he's talking about the politics of crisis talk is to say that there is no neutral way of representing a crisis. There always is something of a political project that is expressed by how we define what is a crisis and what its resolutions or solutions would look like. And so I know that when I teach that particular reading in my class on crisis, and when I talk to other people about it, they find that a useful and interesting point that Gilbert is making, to say, whenever you hear somebody define something as a crisis, whether it's housing or war or in the economy or at post-secondary level or anything else, what is it that they're suggesting is an urgent problem? And what are the inbuilt solutions that they're advancing? And what other potential solutions get excluded by how crisis is being framed? There's a push and a pull, a political struggle, even in how we talk about crisis. And I hope
personal
that
as well as societal. That's interesting. We got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back in 2 minutes with our guest talking about crises and personal crises and political and societal crises, and a book that is coming out in June, essays about crisis that James has written. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having an interesting conversation with James Cairns, who's got a book called In Crisis, On Crisis, Essays in Troubled Times. And it's interesting because it is a collection of different essays that draws on his social research, pop culture, literature, as well as his experience as an activist, a father, a teacher, where he explores the ecological crises, Trump's return to power amidst the so-called crisis of democracy, his own struggle with addiction, which he's talked about already a little bit, and we'll probably get into in greater detail, and other moments of truth facing us today. He's got several different essays that move between personal, theoretical, and historical approaches that he considers about what crises are and how to deal with them, and how to navigate them, and given what we're going through in our current time, I think this sounds like a book well worth reading, and obviously a gentleman that I'm interested in chatting with today. James lives in Paris, Ontario, with his family. He says that it's in the territory that the Holloman Treaty of 1784 recognizes belonging to the Six Nations of the Grand River in perpetuity. So that's another crisis, crisis of reconciliation and treaties. He's a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies, Law, and Social Justice at Wilfrid Laurier University, where his courses and research focus on political theory and social movements. He's also a staff writer at the Hamilton Review of Books. He's the community relations director for the Paris-based Riverside Reading Series. He's published 3 books with the University of Toronto Press: The Myth of the Age of Entitlement, Millennials, Austerity, and Hope. Now that is going to be another book that we got to talk about.
Sure.
Numerous essays and periodicals, such as the Canadian Notes and Queries, the Montreal Review of Books, Briar Patch, et cetera, et cetera. And also an essay called My Struggle and My Struggle. Wow. Sounds like, a prodigious, that's not the right word, a writer of lots of different stuff. I'd love to be in your class sometime. I think your lectures must be fascinating. Your discussions must be really interesting. So let me ask you a question, sir, right off the top, if I could. Lots of people think that there's this Chinese something or other that says every crisis is also an opportunity, and there's the two sides to a situation. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is, in fact, something that you hear right off the top when people raise the question of crisis. I think that my understanding of that particular aphorism has been clarified by a philosopher. His last name is Tang, and he says that in Taoism, a crisis is a period of danger that is also pregnant with the possibility of hope. And I think that is a bit of a twist or a clarification on the way that phrase is normally popularized. To suggest that a crisis is equal parts danger and hope, I think is probably misrepresenting what the crises of our time are. I think that there's a lot more danger than hope.
Can you move forward without a crisis? Isn't it at the time of crisis that you've got the best opportunity to actually move forward? And I'm going to quote a far more important oracle and expert on this topic, Maria in The Sound of Music. And I don't know if you know the scene, but it's a scene where the two principals of The Sound of Music are in a little gazebo in the garden, and Maria is explaining to the captain about that the Mother Superior always says that when God closes a door, God opens a window, but that you also, when faced with a problem, you have to confront it. And he asks, "Is that why you came back?" And she says, "Yes, that's why I came back." So she had a crisis. A door was closed, but the window was opened. But the Mother Superior told her, "You got to go back and confront it, because that's how you find your future."
Mm-hmm.
So I think that crises are the opportunity to open that window. What do you think?
Yes, I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying. I think I'm aligned very much in that idea. I agree, and I think history shows us that how do you get from feudalism in the ancient regime under the kings of Europe to the democracy in the late 1700s, except for through a rupture, an uprising, a crisis that sure it was incomplete and took time to take hold, but that's where democracy came out of. And you can say that about all sorts of moments of progress. The problem is, what about the tens of thousands of people who were killed in the streets of Paris, justly or unjustly, along the way? And I guess trying to figure out how to both recognize and kind of believe in and trust in the possibility that a period of crisis is that moment of breakthrough, transformation, moving towards something better that you're talking about, while also recognizing the wreckage and the violence that the crises of our time cause. That's something that I find I'm constantly trying to think through. I mean, how do you think about?
Let's turn to the personal then, and see what there is. I've interviewed and met and know personally other people that have been addicted to alcohol, and often, not often, several of them can say you can be a functional alcoholic for a long time. That some people think that the guy that was appointed to the Supreme Court is a functional alcoholic and has been for a long time. And there was a fair amount of testimony in the Supreme Court hearings about that. And I think that lots of us know people that are functional alcoholics and can be quite successful, whether they be university professors or business people or Supreme Court justices. And that numerous people have told me that it takes something unbelievable, like a heart attack, like a doctor that's going to tell them that they're going to die, like a car accident, like going to jail, like almost killing somebody, that causes the catalyst for them to change. So, wait, did you just decide I'm gonna go on the wagon, or did you have a crisis that changed your life?
No, I think you put your finger very much on my experience. Not only, obviously the phrase that comes to mind, and I think it's sort of there in the not only in crisis memoir, or beg your pardon, sobriety memoirs, but in it fits the metaphor of crisis, but hitting rock bottom, right? So you hit rock bottom and then you can turn things around or not. I mean, lots of people hit rock bottom and they don't turn it around and things get worse and the catastrophe deepens. But that was certainly part of my experience along the way, that there were moments of reckoning where sort of something needed to change, or the disaster could be fatal or ruin relationships that were at the center of my life. But interesting to me, and what I explore in the one essay in the book that's really focused on my history of drinking and blackout drinking and so on, is it's that moment of clarity that I've experienced at different moments, say 10 or 12 times in my attempts to stop drinking between my early 20s and when I last stopped 7 years ago, is the moment of reckoning, which I have experienced as a sudden rupture of clarity and realization and a commitment to stop that I didn't possess and didn't feel 5 minutes earlier. And if I had 5 minutes earlier, I would have done so. Certainly didn't feel it 5 days before, 5 months before. And why not? Why did it take this specific second for that to come through? I know that's not everybody's experience. I read stories about people who, they know they need to stop. And so they go to an AA meeting, but they're still drinking and they sort of arrive at that conclusion. That's fine. People come through it in their own ways. I'm not saying mine's the only way, but for me, that crisis moment of recognizing like this is a path forward that had to happen, can happen, and in my kind of apprehension of it is already happening. I am shifting into a new state of being as in my commitment to sobriety. That does feel like a crisis.
You used an interesting word, rupture of clarity. What's a rupture?
Well, a rupture is, an explosion.
Tell us what
a rupture.
Tell us what happened, if you could.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the rupture is in my understanding of myself, my relationship to alcohol, what I'm capable of. It is a moment in which everything in me is committed to continuing with the drinking life. And that comes with all the things that you can imagine. People talk about it all the time. You tell lies to yourself, you tell lies to others. You say, I'll do it differently this time. You make rules, only 2 glasses, only 3 days a week, and you break them immediately and totally, and you still maintain the pretense that you're going to change this time, and so on and so on. And then something shifts, and I don't know how to describe it other than the experience of it, which is like a recognition, an understanding, a willingness to change that is sudden and total. If there's any waffling in my mind, like, well, maybe tomorrow, I'm not doing it, and it's just another tactic to keep drinking. And in that moment, the walls move away from me. I think my jaw begins to unclench. The molecules in my body that are craving the next drink, no matter when it is, begin to accept the fact that one isn't coming, even though that's going to mean sweaty nights and, spiders in my veins and so on. And the sober self emerges in control in a way that it hadn't just before. And to me, that's a breakthrough, a rupture, an upending of what it meant for me to exist just prior to that happening.
So lots of people that I've spoken to about addiction have said they know they've got to change. They think they've got to change. They get lots of counseling. They read books. They, go to courses, therapists, whatever. But they don't until something happens that's the critical turning point. Is that your experience?
Yes. Yeah. But I guess in my experience, the something that happens is a 2-part piece. One is something terrible. And so whether it's a matter of having caused physical harm to myself, whether it's a matter of destroying relationships, I've had therapists before say, when it comes to drinking, is it affecting your relationships? Is it affecting your job? Is it affecting your finances? And when the answer to those 3 things is just like, they are totally ruined and out of control, all of them, or whatever, they're on the verge of total breakdown, and one of them hits the wall or hits rock bottom, there's that. But then there is also this other kind of internal piece that is able to move from hitting rock bottom in that way into a new period, a new commitment. And I don't know why that is available in some circumstances and not others. Because if you trace
clarity,
back
because up until then, you don't know for sure. It's questioned. So, yeah, number one, do you have something from the book that talks about this? I think it'd be interesting for us all to hear from your book something, an excerpt from that part of your life at this rupture of clarity. If you've got it, you could read for us. That'd be great. But also, as I think about some of these other crises that you've talked about, it's been a similar kind of a situation. I think about your comment about the crisis of tariffs or stuff, and go back to the election of 1988, and John Turner told Brian Mulroney, if you give up your economic sovereignty, ultimately you'll give up, or you'll be threatened to give up your political sovereignty. That was what?
Yeah.
That was 45 years ago. And it's not happened until now. And Trump won. He increased tariffs. He made threats. He renegotiated NAFTA. And we could see the potentiality of what was going on. I don't think we had that turning point, if I could call it turning point. Maybe it's your rupture of clarity, until he said 51st state, invisible line, and that Trudeau was a governor. And that culminated in the Five Nations hockey games and tournament, where regular people, hockey fans, booed the national anthem of the United States.
Yes.
I think that was a turning point. And I think that if we didn't have the challenge to us as a sovereign nation, and described so meanly as 51st state governor, invisible line, well, we could have just gone on, and the tariffs would have increased, and we would have. But because of that, everyone got on board. And you go through, I think climate change. Al Gore was talking about climate change. When was it? 2000?
Yeah, the 90s. Yeah,
90? Like just as soon as he left the vice presidency. And we've got people that are climate change deniers. We've got wildfires. We got floods. We got a whole bunch of things that might be indicative of a climate change issue. We've got smart scientists that say that, we've already gone too far, but we don't seem to be doing enough about it. And you know what? We can get rid of it if someone says axe the tax. And so we don't change. So I don't think anything's going to happen positive on climate change until we have a crisis, and we call it a crisis, but obviously it's not. We don't have that rupture of clarity yet because it hasn't enough of a crisis. Anyway, let's take a break.
But then, yeah, sounds good. I want to ask you a question, but I can ask them to come back.
Okay, but get your book out, because I want to hear you read something from the book. We're going to take a break. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with our guest, James Cairns, who's written a really interesting book, comes out in June, all about crises. And it's a bunch of essays about crisis. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I'm having a really interesting conversation today with James Cairns, who is a professor in what is it? Social. What's your professor in? Social justice?
Well, it's a department. The department is a Department of Indigenous Studies, Law, and Social Justice. I'm in a program within that department called Law and Society. It's big. It's big. Well, our problems are big.
And you are coming out with a book called In Crisis, On Crisis, Essays in Troubled Times. You've written numerous other books. We've been talking a lot about crises. You were going to ask when we took a break something about my sort of description of how I think crises are critical. They are the catalyst. And you've sort of suggested that's right in a personal situation. Don't you think that's right in everything?
Yeah, I do, and I do think that the changes that we've seen toward progress, social justice, equity, democracy have been, as you just said, motivated by and the outcome of a crisis. The question that I have to you or to all of us is, do we risk then thinking that things have to get worse before they get better? There is a danger in sort of thinking you have to hit rock bottom. Don't we have to hit rock bottom? I don't know. I can't. There's something perverse in a political theory that says, well, the inequalities and injustices of our time won't be addressed until things get even worse for more people, and they'll resist. And I have an essay in the book that takes this idea of the worse the better. Is that true for movements for democracy and justice? But I think that's a dangerous assumption. And yet we can see all kinds of examples that you have just described, and I agree with, about how as situations deteriorate, as things get worse, that can end up being a movement for something better. But we also see things in history where something bad happens and things just get worse. They don't get better. We've
been talking about the housing crisis. We've been talking about the housing crisis for numerous years. I think it was 2023, the Ford government had 56 recommendations on how to deal with the housing crisis. They implemented something like 6 of them. So we've been talking, and we've had massive increases in housing prices for a long period of time. I had someone on my show, I think it was a year or two ago, talking about the risk of civil unrest because young people were robbed of the opportunity to buy houses.
Yes.
This past year, the city of Toronto, increased the development fees on houses by 47%. And a councillor said, a high percentage of nothing is still nothing. We're like, we're not doing anything. And I think that condos are down by, some people think 26%.
Yeah.
We're in a condo crisis. It's going to take something comparable to the declines in prices like the United States had in 2008, 2009, or we had in 1990, for there to be an impact on housing prices and on this housing crisis. And I think.
But then, what do people do in the meantime? What do people do in the meantime who want to see those things fixed? There's almost the idea that
fight, and they put forward policies, and they argue, just like we're doing on climate change, just like we're doing on democracy, just like we're doing on authoritarian. Go through whatever the list is.
I see.
But until you get that catalyst, until you hit rock bottom, until you have a 26% decline, and yet it hasn't happened with single-family homes. Single-family homes, the inventory of single-family homes for sale is the highest it's ever been, but it hasn't impacted prices yet. Until you hit that crisis, I don't think people get on board. Until Trump says Trudeau's the governor, you're the 51st state, there's an invisible line, and regular hockey players, boo. You don't have the public support to change things. And take a look, Axe the Tax had a 26% lead in the polls in November, December, and changed such that Carney won. That's got to have been triggered by a crisis.
100%.
Okay.
Yes.
You're going to read something personal.
Yes. So here's an excerpt from the essay is called Blackout, and it's it generally speaking is sort of reflecting on how do I deal with these blackouts of my past, not only individual episodes of blackout drinking, which I've suffered from seriously, but kind of whole periods of that can feel lost to problem drinking. Okay. In Sarah Heppela's Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forgot, she writes that even a sober person can't always tell when their drunk friend is blacked out. Watch me, Heppela says, in the middle of a blackout, you'll see a woman on her way to somewhere else with no idea her memory just snapped in half. The imagery resonates with me because it evokes a before and after, a decisive break in being. After blacking out once at the Imperial Pub in Toronto, I returned to consciousness a few blocks away, lying on damp pavement in an alley. My shoes and eyeglasses were missing. I don't know where I'd been. I never found the stuff I lost. When I fell into the blackout, I went elsewhere. I'd returned changed. Heppela describes coming out of a blackout while on a magazine assignment in France. The last thing she recalls is exiting a cab after a heavy night of drinking with friend. She walks with purpose from the taxi to the stairs in her hotel lobby, then the curtain falls. Blackness. Now I'm quoting Heppela. She says, "When the curtain lifts again, this is what I see. There is a bed and I'm on it. The lights are low. Sheets are wrapped around my ankles, soft and cool against my skin. I'm on top of a guy I've never seen before, and we're having sex. End quote. She seems to be enjoying it. The man seems to know who she is. She's not scared, just clueless. They finish, and she lies in the crook of his arm thinking, how did I get here? How does anyone get here? Why drink to the point of blackout? Hepala says she drank to ease social inhibitions, obliterate her body, and forget the harm her drinking caused. I, too, drank to manage sexual anxieties. I also relished dancing on a chair at the party's center, and I knew that drinking would get me there. Yet my reasons for drinking to oblivion never seemed rational to me. I don't know how to describe them without sounding comically abstract, arrogant, absurd. I drank to what? I don't know. To black out in order to feel nothing, or to feel everything without distinction. I wanted to experience total control over all of God's green earth, to sense meaningful changes of space, time, and self, to approach the thrill of catastrophe, death. In Karl Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, he says that capitalism alienates people from our capacity to labor, as well as from one another, our very core to being human. Amid the life-destroying demands and violence of capitalism, who doesn't ache to feel whole, alive, free, of significance, of value? Who isn't at some level trying to escape? Why did I drink that way is a good question, and one that I've spent many hours in therapy trying to answer. But 6 years into my latest stretch of sobriety, it's not the question that troubles me most. When I lie awake at 3 a.m., I'm thinking, what do I do with all those blackouts? How do I relate to so much lost time? Time lost both in the sense that the blackouts are in the past and therefore unchangeable, and the sense that when I lived them, they were in that moment already gone.
Very powerful. Thank you for reading that. We're going to take a final break and come back with just a few concluding questions and comments in 2 minutes with our guest, James Cairns, who's written a really interesting book about crises. It comes out in June. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got James Cairns. He's a professor, and he's written a book about in crisis, on crisis, essays in troubled times. It comes out in June, and it's about crises of our time, but also a crisis that he went through. And he's really talked about today a personal crisis. But it's interesting because he's really comparing, the triggers of crises that we engage in and encounter personally, as well as from a societal standpoint, and look for things. And he's talked about the crisis paradigm, the rupture of clarity, hitting rock bottom. We've talked about whether there's crisis and the other side opportunity. He says he doesn't have a battle-tested thesis on how to get through it all. We've talked about my love of the sound of music again, which I love. When God closes a door, she opens a window. I love that she referred to it as she. So I got one other sort of trite line, sir, that people often use and ask you if you think it's true, which is, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. What do you think of that?
Well, no, I guess I think that there is wisdom in the recognition that our experiences, especially troubling ones, can be ones that we learn from. And the question of whether we are able to come out better on the other side is answered in different ways. I think it has a lot to do with what sort of supports and social situation a person's been in, rather than expecting all of the change and the resilience to reside within their own individual temperament or resolve. I think that there's some things that don't kill us, but make our lives much more difficult to live, and which lead to suffering endlessly.
So I'm not suggesting that you wanted to go through those blackouts or go through that drinking, but what you read was very powerful. And I wonder if you could be as prolific an author, as compelling an author, as good a professor, as knowledgeable and wise as you've become today, if you hadn't gone through those terrible crises.
Thank you. I hear what you're saying. And absolutely, I've thought a lot about how I simply wouldn't be me. I mean, I wouldn't see the world in the same way. I don't think I would have developed the approach to empathy and understanding that has led me to who I am now.
So are you stronger? Are you better? Or are you more you because of what you went through?
Sure, yes. And yet I have caused a lot of harm to myself and others. And that is not something that is absolved and justified because of the improvement or strength found on the other side. And I think I spent a lot of time actually thinking about just how close I came to utter destruction many different times, and only by the grace of God, the luck of the draw, my own privilege as a member of a loving family, and all sorts of other advantages I have that have left me where I am, and other people aren't so lucky. And so I hear what you're saying, and I think there's truth in it, but in my own situation, it feels a lot more tenuous.
James Cairns, thank you so much for joining us. Remind us the name of the book, when it comes out, and how we can get it.
In Crisis, on Crisis, Essays in Troubled Times. It comes out on June the 10th. The publisher is Woolsack and Wynn, which is an independent publishing house out of Hamilton, Ontario. WOLSAK and Wynn, WYNN.ca is the website where you can find a pre-order link as well as purchase the book after it's out, although it'll be in bookstores too.
That was an interesting conversation tonight, James. Thanks so much for joining us. I remind you, everybody, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream it online, even from Paris, Ontario, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website and on social media and on YouTube and on podcast surfers as soon as the radio show goes to air. My second cousin lives in Paris. I'm going to have to come out and visit him and come see you. That's our show for today.
Beautiful place.
Good night.